Hello, community, and welcome back to another Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, C-Suite Trusted Advisor, Board Director, and Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Consultant, helping members of the C-Suite and their teams reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. We are back with our second conversation with attorney Joel Richardson of the McCune Law Group. And if you were with me for the first conversation, you know that you might have to pull out a law book just to keep up. I know I am, but that's okay. Attorney Richardson is going to be gracious enough to remember to explain some of these things in layman's terms so that we all can stay with him in the conversation. And if you will remember, at the end of the last podcast, I acknowledged that some of this conversation might make you feel a little uncomfortable. Lean into the discomfort community in any situation, whether it's these conversations or anything else that you have to deal with in life. Discomfort is a reminder to you that your awareness is being raised. So lean into it, explore it, and see what you can learn from it. Attorney Richardson, thank you so much for coming back for our second conversation. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having us. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Your first conversation was so chock full of information. Some of it new knowledge, NEW knowledge, and some of it new knowledge, KNEW knowledge, like the fact that affirmative action was kind of kicked to the curbs, shall we say, 25 years ago here in California. So my question for you is, considering the history that California has in terms of affirmative action, how do you think that has impacted the workforce that we see today?
So, if you assume that your college crowd helps to inform or staff your workforce, then we have a situation where we've got less people of color coming up in certain areas, particularly Black and brown. In the state of California, it might not so much be the same case with our Asian community or some aspects of the Asian community, but certainly in the Black and brown community. And so I think it's important to understand that I think California proves that this is not a liberal or conservative issue. In 1996, California passed Prop 209, which got rid of affirmative action in admissions. And in all of the premier UCs, for instance, UCLA, Berkeley, et cetera, institutions in the state of California that have a devastating effect on Black and brown admissions. And we have not recovered from it, to be clear. We have not recovered from it. And so if you assume that that helps to inform who's actually in the workplace, then simply put, you have less kids, young people from those particular, with that particular pedigree, making it into corporate America. Often the ticket in corporate America can be where you went to school. That's a big portion of it. That's a big piece of it. And so that obviously would have a negative effect. Years later, and I think it was just 2 or 3 years ago on the ballot, California, which is far more liberal now, has all the Democratic state politicians, has been for many years, had an opportunity to bring affirmative action back, and they declined to do it. So what that means, what that reminds us all of, that this actually isn't, at its best and at its worst, it's not a Democratic or Republican issue. It's not actually a political issue at all. You've got liberal white people that are just as concerned about a lost advantage or the potential of a lost advantage than conservative white people are. There are some folks that believe that this is the way to go to be as fair as possible, but you have to judge fairness, and we talked about that a little bit in the last show, by the entire story. And so when you're trying to be fair, you can't start at the middle of the story. You can't, there's this picture that talks about equity, inclusion, et cetera.
Seen that.
You've got the folks standing at the gate or whatever else.
Right.
But, the gate is different places. People are different heights, and there's a historical significance to why they're standing where they're standing, and you can't ignore that. So, but it would absolutely have a devastating effect on corporate America because you don't have as many people with a corporate America pedigree as it pertains to maybe the top places, the quote top places, the big six accounting firms, or whatever it might be. That obviously is going to have an effect.
So, community, just to give you a little bit of context about what Attorney Richardson just said about folks standing in front of the fence, there's a picture that is often used in DEI programs where it's got three people standing behind the fence. They're three different heights, and they've got three different boxes to try and raise them to equal status, but it still doesn't fix the problem until someone says, why don't we just remove the fence? So that's what he's referring to in that context. Attorney Richardson, when you mention the fact that Black and brown people in particular who don't have access to specific colleges, that goes back to what you said about legacy programs, is because my parents went here, that's my ticket to go here. And I personally believe that higher education is the great equalizer. To your point, that once you've got that school name behind you, it opens some doors that you otherwise would not have access to. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. I think the good news is I believe in bubble up and bubble down. So if you go to someone's notion of a quote lesser school, and you have the mentors and you're in the right situations or whatever else, that you can bubble up, but it is made more difficult. I don't think there's any question about that. Depending on what schools you go to and how well you do at that school, maybe if I go to a second tier undergrad institution, I have to be at the very, very top of the class to go to an Ivy League law school, for instance, or grad school. But maybe if I'm at UC Berkeley, I don't have to be at the very, very top of the class to go to that Ivy League law school. And so being in that space at all creates an advantage that's frankly hard to overcome for those that don't have that advantage. Mm-hmm. You add, the notion of resources. Even amongst the UC schools, by the way, we have a lawsuit we're getting ready to file about this. Even the of color UC schools, even though most of them are, most of the Cal States will qualify as Hispanic service institutions, but the Hispanic service institutions in the UC system are UC Riverside, UC Merced. You look at their resources and they're drastically different. And so even within the UC system, they'll advertise this great education throughout. And it's not saying that at UC Riverside, I'm not saying that you don't get a good education, that they don't excel. What I'm saying is that they do it with less resources that are only explained racially and economically. And so when you have less resources in a pedigree-filled world, it's going to have an effect. And it just has you climbing. Or now, if you go to school X or school Y, school Z, you're more likely to take on debt in order to do it. So now you can't come out of school and go to the Peace Corps, or you'll be owing a bunch of money forever. So there's some things that happen that make it self-perpetuating. And if you are first generation, you don't have all of this figured out, you just think you're doing good going to school, and you are. But there are other things. There's like so many dimensions to this game that if you aren't in that space, that you don't know about. And so you spend quite a bit of time trying to make up for the things that are lost. But part of that is identifying those things that are lost.
You mentioned the complexities of these types of conversations that we're having now as a result of what's just happening in society today. And in terms of the case that you're working on now, do you foresee similar cases happening in the future specific to the workforce?
Yeah, I think so. They're going to be that way. I think that there are companies that are sue conscious, that don't want to get sued, may do preemptive things that aren't necessarily in line with the law right now. They might have the best of intentions of doing that. In terms of them doing what they're doing, they want a diverse workforce, but they don't want to get sued in order to do it. Others will do the same things with different purposes. If they don't want to be diverse, where there's a will, there's a way. If they don't want to be diverse, well, then maybe this is their opportunity to not be diverse and call it them making sure that they're complying with the law, which would be their way of, quote, getting ahead of the game. So yeah, I think that there will be litigation in that space because there has to be, and we'll see kind of how it happens and how it develops. But depending on the jurisdiction and the judges, the people that you're in front of, it might make for different and contrary results.
I want to go back really quickly to this article that I referenced early in our first conversation. The legal assault on corporate diversity efforts has begun. And what you just said reminds me of a quote in here that says, companies that say their initiatives fall within the law, they feel pretty good about things. But privately, many companies are asking their lawyers if and how much they should modify their methods in light of the affirmative action decision. And prior to all this happening, the question that I was really focusing on over the last few months really was, instead of focusing on what's the why for DEI, because there's lots of data that proves why it's good, not only for better business decisions, not only to represent the community within you work, within which you reside, not only does it increase the bottom line, but there are a myriad reasons why you should do diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. The why not is what I encourage people to think about. Why aren't you doing it? And some people feel like you're taking my slice of the pie versus seeing it as an opportunity to make a larger pie so that everyone gets a slice. So to your point, this might almost be an escape clause for some companies. Yet in 2020, lots of companies made lots of commitments. They made lots of statements. They gave lots of money. When you flip like that, there's a term for it called diversity washing. So is the risk for being seen as someone who's being promoting diversity washing versus being serious about a more sustainable workforce worth the worth the fallout, I should say, from society? Let's look at Bud, for example. They got called out for the diversity washing. So are these laws, the things that have happened on college campuses, is that an excuse for some organizations to say, we're going to wash our hands of it, it's in the law, we don't have to do this anymore?
Some will use it that way, at worst. Some that sense an opportunity that way. There are plenty of people that want to be diverse, and it's difficult because, among other things, we're fighting against a culture. Black folks might be, or people of color might be more likely to go into certain fields that relate to the struggle, the civil rights, and the things like that. You know what I mean? They might feel more comfortable in a particular part of the country, in urban as opposed to rural, or whatever else. There could be any number of reasons why they may not want to go that route. But then there are companies that don't want to be diverse, right?
And that's their right. That's their right, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's their right on some level. And they don't see any penalty or negative with them not doing so, and perhaps this enables them to do that, right? And so I guess what'll have to happen, I imagine, is there will be people that will use that, but can there be a demonstration, a renewed demonstration of how diversity affects the bottom line? I think that's very important. And to go forward, the civil rights movement had an economic component. There was a moral component, right? They wanted to conduct themselves a certain way. They were connected to a higher purpose. But there was also an economic component. The Montgomery bus boycott, nobody Black rode the bus, period, for a year. So now all of this economy that you're relying on, all this money you're relying on, it's not there. So now, whether it's for your own selfish reasons, from economically or for social reasons, now you're being forced to make a decision that way. The question becomes whether and to what extent people would be on the same page and speaking with their dollars similarly. The idea that opportunities are there for some and some of those types of things, I think makes it more difficult for a large group of people to be on the same page that way. But I think if one can demonstrate the economic impact of being diverse versus not being diverse, that has the potential to, perhaps have an effect.
I would agree with you 100%. This is also a good place to pause this conversation, community. And when we come back for our third conversation with Attorney Richardson, we're going to get into the whole notion of boycotts and how that is a legal option to make sure that we are still, as a nation, doing the right thing. If you want to hear this conversation again or our first conversation with Attorney Richardson, please go to my website at dranita.com. If you're a new member today, remember you have to spell out the word dranita.com. And on the landing page in the top in the center, you want to click the link that says Keeping It Real Podcast. In the meantime, please join the community and get in the flow. Follow, like, and overshare any broadcast that helps you reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.